Hello, this is Paranormal Girl, and today we are going to speak about legends of the fairy folk. Legends of fairies have been around for thousands of years, but what exactly are they? The word itself is a combination of Middle English and French spelling. However, there are other cultures who have legends of these creatures under different names. In ancient Rome, they were called Fata, meaning the fates of Roman mythology. In Greek mythology, they were part of the Moirae, which was essentially the same thing. These creatures decided the fate of people. In Ireland, the legends speak of another race, the Tuatha De Danann, which were thought to be the people of the gods. In English, it became the word fae and had the suffix "eri" or "re" added to it, and came to mean otherworldly creatures who performed specific tasks. It has diversified meanings, anything from being extremely helpful, such as the brownie or the sprite, which would come into homes and clean or otherwise assist while the residents were asleep, or having evil connotations, mainly from Christian propaganda. They are represented in many forms, from childlike winged creatures to imposing larger-than-life elementals of nature. The four elements of earth, air, water, and fire are thought by some to be where fairies originate. By this belief, they are not only creatures meant to help, they are essential to the balance of these elements. These types of fairies have made appearances in literature such as The Lady of the Lake, giving King Arthur the sword of Excalibur, and many renderings of winged sylphs that have become familiar with. These creatures live in harmony with the elements. Fire fairies or salamanders are often thought to be mischievous and destructive in nature. Another belief taken from the Persian mythology is that fairies are creatures that were once angels. In this legend, when Lucifer and some of the angels revolted against God and were cast out, there were some that got caught in the doorway, so to speak. It is thought that they were strongly persecuted by demons, as they lacked the strength to stand up and take one side or another in the war against God. Nothing did more to seal the negative connotation of fairies than the advent of the Puritan movement. The brownies, sprites, and hobgoblins of yesteryear went from being helpful spirits that were welcome to evil demons out to destroy souls. The fairies of legends fell to the way of anything that was considered witchcraft or wizardry. Anyone thought to be encouraging their presence was dealt with in the same manner by the religious authorities as witches or sorcerers. While this severe form of control did not last until the modern times, its effects are felt to this day. Beliefs in fairies as otherworldly creatures has been around for centuries. They have appeared in paintings and in literature, mainly as the winged creatures of children's stories we have all enjoyed. In Gaelic folklore, however, there are very powerful beings descended from gods and goddesses, and they are known as the Eossi, or the people of the mounds. The mounds where they are thought to exist are called Cedar. These beings were thought to be tall and incredibly imposing. The people of the villages would refer to them as the fair folk, or the good folk, smiling all the time in hopes that their positive affirmations would keep them in good standing. A collection of writings known as the Liber Gabála Érenn speaks of the legends of Ireland, and these people known also as Tuatha De Danann. According to Irish mythology, they were one of the earliest groups of people to settle there. The legends say that the battles and invasion of other races wore them down, and they retreated to many hidden mounds known as the Cedar, and many believe they never left. Many of these mounds have been discovered to be ancient graves, which to some gives even further credence to the souls remaining there. Many Scottish legends classify fairies as two types. Both are powerful, but the Seelies are known for mischief and tomfoolery, while the Unseelies are more dangerous and malevolent. One of the most disturbing legends of the fairies that show up in many different folk tales are that of the changeling. The changeling was, when it was believed, a human baby was traded for a fairy child. Depending on the tale, the human child either lived happily in the new environment or was miserable, longing for the life of a human being. With all the legends circulating about these mysterious creatures, it begs the question, is there any grain of truth in it at all? Suppose documentation of fairies came about in the early 1900s with the Cottingley case. Two cousins claimed to have caught several photographs of themselves with almost storybook-like images and what appeared to be fairies in Cottingley in England. They even captured the interest of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of the famous Sherlock Holmes stories. Technology and the later confession of Francis Griffiths, one of the cousins, in 1983 indicated the photographs are clever fakes. Many legends and myths have some basis in history, and it's thought that what are believed to have been gods and goddesses of ancient times may have actually been great leaders deified as such. Are the ancient mounds in the sprawling countryside of Ireland actually where the AC were forced underground after so many invasions? Is it thought that when they went to live within the confines of the mounds that they entered a dimension outside of their own, a dimension running parallel with ours? If not immortal, maybe these mound dwellers lived there underground until they perished, or maybe their descendants exist there today. So we'll have a little look at the Arthur Conan Doyle case of the Cottingley fairies. Arthur Conan Doyle devoted a whole chapter of his book, The Edge of the Unknown, to a detailed argument that Houdini had genuine psychic powers, but wouldn't admit it. Curiously, Doyle and Houdini remained friends for a long while, in spite of public clashes over spiritualism. It was this point that Houdini, who stayed good friends with Arthur Conan Doyle, came to England to meet with the girls who claim they saw fairies. It was in 1917, two teenage girls in Yorkshire produced photographs that they had taken fairies in the garden. Elsie Wright, aged 16, and her cousin Frances Griffiths, aged 10, used a simple camera and was said to be lacking any knowledge of photography or photographic trickery. Frances and the Fairies, July 1917, taken by Elsie, in that picture there. Photo 1, above, taken in July, showed Frances in the garden with a waterfall in the background and a bush in the foreground. 4 fairies are dancing upon the bush. 3 have wings and 1 is playing a long flute-like instrument. Frances is not looking at the fairies, just in front of her, but seems to be posing for the camera. Though the waterfall is blurred, indicating a slow shutter speed, the fairies are not blurred, even though they're leaping in the air. Here's a more detailed picture. Now, they always maintained that they actually did see the fairies, but there was evidence that the girls at some point said they did hoax the fairies and pinned some pictures up. I'm a little suspicious with this little area here. It may be grass, or it might be a pin, who knows? But they do look like they have been cut out of a book. But as we go on, things start to get a little strange. So we have a look at photograph number 2. Photo 2, taken in September, showed Elsie sitting in the lawn reaching out her hand to a friendly gnome who's about a foot high with wings. He's stepping forward onto the hem of a wide skirt, but there's something wrong with this picture. Look at the shape of her hand, it's too long. It's very elongated, almost like her hand shot forward and then the photograph was taken. I don't know. It's a little odd, that one. Photographic experts who were consulted declare that none of the negatives had been tampered with. There was no evidence of double exposure, and that a slight blurring of the fairies in the photograph number 1 indicated that fairy was moving during the exposure at 1.50 and 1.100 second. They seem not to even entertain the simpler explanation that the fairies were simple paper cutouts fastened on the bush, jiggling slightly in the breeze. Doyle and other believers were also troubled by the fact that the fairy's wings showed blurred movement even in the picture of the fairy calmly posed suspended in mid-air. Apparently fairy wings don't work like hummingbirds' wings. Hardly anyone can look at these photos today without accepting them as anything but fakes. The lighting on the fairies do not match that of the girls. The fairy figures have flat cutout appearances, but spiritualists and others who prefer the word of magic and fantasy accepted the photos as genuine evidence for fairies. 3 years later, the girls produced 3 more photographs. With this one, you can clearly see Frances jolting backwards, hence the blurriness of her. And yet, if you look at this fairy here, she's quite sharp. And again, it says Frances and the Leaping Fairy, showing a slightly blurred profile of Frances with the winged fairy suspended in midair just in front of her nose. The background and the fairy are not blurred. It's very good. Next photograph. Photo number 4. Shows a fairy hovering in midair offering a flower to Elsie. Well, this fairy may be standing on a branch, but the fairy images very indeterminable distance from the cameras, and if you look, she almost looks transparent. You can see Elsie gazing on her intently. This is quite a good picture. Photo number 5, fairies and their sun bath, is the only one that looks as if it could have been accidental or deliberate double exposure. But if you look carefully, even though this fairy is very transparent, if you look carefully here, this also is very transparent. And something is going on here as well. Considering these girls only had a very basic camera, this begs to differ. How could they have made this picture transparent? Bearing in mind they're only little girls and they had a simple camera, they knew nothing of double exposure that I would have said. And there is a lot that's going on in this picture. Something here as well going on. I am sure this is what they call a fairy bower. Almost like I can see an arm here and what looks like a shoulder and possibly some hair. It might be another fairy just coming into view. And if you look carefully here and here, this definitely looks like other fairy wings forming. So again, I think you've got to keep an open mind, because there's definitely something going on in this picture. And look here. I don't think this has ever been shown. There is a face. There's some hair, 2 eyes and a nose. Very pixie looking. How about that? Wow. Don't think anyone spotted that one, have they? Again, partially hidden amongst the grass and the flowers. There's no way they could have faked that. And there's another partial face here. See this? Nose, eyes, hair. Very clever. Wow. So let's have a look. Fairies in the sun bath. Yes. The girls said they could not photograph the fairies when anyone else was watching. No one else could see photographs of the fairies. There was only one independent witness, Jeffrey L. Hodson, a writer who claimed to see the... Sorry, I can't say that word. A writer who claimed to see the fairies and confirmed the girls' observations in all details. Arthur Conan Doyle not only accepted these photos as genuine, he even wrote 2 pamphlets and a book attesting the genuineness of these photos and including additional fairy lore. His book, The Coming of the Fairies, is still in print, and some people still believe the photos are authentic. Doyle's books make very interesting reading even today. Doyle's beliefs in spiritualism convinced many people that the creator of Sherlock Holmes was not as bright as his fictional creation. Some thought Conan Doyle crazy, but he defended the reality of the fairies and all the evidence he could gather. He counters at the arguments of the disbelievers eloquently and at great length. In fact, his evidence and arguments sound surprisingly similar in every respect to those a present-day book touting the idea that aliens visit us in UFOs. Robert Schaefer wrote a clever article drawing these parallels beautifully. Over the years, the mystery persisted. Only a few diehards now believe the photos are real fairies, but the mystery of the details of how and why they were made continued to fascinate serious students of hoaxes, frauds, and deceptions. When the girls as adults were interviewed, their responses were evasive. In a BBC broadcast interview in 1975, Elsie said, "I told you that they were photographs of figments of our imagination, and that's what I'm sticking to." In 1977, Fred Gettings stumbled on an important evidence while working on a study of early 19th century book illustrations. He found drawings by Claude A. Shepperson in a 1915 children's book, which the girls could easily have possessed and which were, without a doubt, the models for the fairies which appeared in the photos. A curious fact is that in this book, a compilation of short stories and poems for children by various authors, there's a story, Bimbashi Joyce, by Arthur Conan Doyle. Surely he received a copy from the publisher. If Doyle had noticed this picture, and if he had the sort of perceptiveness he had attributed to Sherlock Holmes, he might have concluded that Cottingley photographs were fakes. But maybe not. Believers are good at seeing what they believe and not seeing things that challenge their beliefs. Or perhaps the close match of drawings and photos in the supernatural psychic coincidence is a supernatural psychic coincidence. Elsie and Francis and Mr. Hodson are still living, or were still living, in 1977 and continued to stick to their story, affirming the genuineness of the fairies and the photos. Then in 1982, the girls admitted in interviews with Joe Cooper that they had faked the first 4 photographs. As many as suspected all along, the girls had used paper cutouts of fairy drawings. No great photographic skills were required, though the photos do show some good artistic composition. Elsie had artistic skill and even worked for a few months in a photographer's shop retouching the photographs. But the girls probably did no retouching on these photos. The simplest of means, just cut out drawings of fairies stuck on shrubbery, were all that was required to dupe gullible and predisposed minds like those of Arthur Conan Doyle and Geoffrey Hodson and Edgar Gardner. Many of the copies of these photos had been circulated and had been suspected of having been improved by retouching. This certainly may be true of the photos being prepared by publications in books. and desire being for the clearest possible result of the printed page. However, those who say the pictures are too good to have been taken by teenage amateur photographers are showing an unwarranted prejudice, not consistent with the facts revealed by analysts of the original photos. Some have claimed to see a slight blurring of the fairy images, when in fact the fairies are more sharply defined than the girls' images. On the matter of Conan Doyle's gullibility, Gilbert Chesterton said, "It has long seemed to me that Sir Arthur's mentality is much more that of Watson than it is of Holmes." And I also have found a Bradford and West Yorkshire paper story of the Cottingley Fairies, entitled Next Stop Fairyland. Once upon a time it was thought fairies could be found at the bottom of the garden right here in Bradford. Bus travellers arriving in Cottingley were even told that they had arrived in Fairyland, all because of a series of photos taken by two girls in 1917. One Saturday afternoon in 1917, two Bradford cousins, 10-year-old Frances Griffiths and 17-year-old Elsie Wright, went out into the garden with Elsie's father's camera. On their return they claimed that they had seen fairies at the bottom of the garden next to Cottingley Beck, and that they had even photographed them. The images captured on the camera by the girls showed images of fairies dancing. Could it be that now there was real evidence that fairies existed, captured right here in Bradford? Perhaps the world would never have known about the Cottingley Fairies, but in 1920 Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Detective Sherlock Holmes, not only wrote about the existence of the photos in the Strand magazine, but declared them to be authentic. Would Holmes and Watson have been so convinced? Throughout her life, Frances always maintained the fairies were real. But 5 years before her death, Elsie Wright decided to come clean. Speaking on a BBC programme nationwide in 1983, Elsie exclaimed, "At that time women wore great big pinwheel hats, you know, with great big crowns, and they never had taken their hat pins about. They have to take their hat pins about this long. If fashion had been different, then there may well have been no Cottingley Fairies." Elsie's father's camera, that's a picture of it here, has found a home in Bradford's National Museum of Photography, Film and Television. Colin Hardin, the museum's curator of the photographic technology, says Elsie wrote letters in the Yorkshire Post where she finally admitted they were fake, that they were paper cutouts mounted on 2 twigs using hat pins, and that while some of the photos were faked, some of them indeed were real photographs. Morris Attock's mother went to school with Elsie Wright in Cottingley, but he thinks the whole thing was a fake, although he does think the girls helped out Cottingley on the map. "My mother used to come to school with her, and she used to draw fairies all over her exercise book. So she was very artistic, except that Elsie Wright said in later life that they were cut out of paper and stuck on hat pins, and out into the trees, and no one could see just how they were done. The older people used to call the village Fairyland. Even the bus conductors used to say, when they got to Cottingley Bay, 'Fairyland for people getting off the bus.'" Margaret Cooper, who is also from Cottingley, thinks the fairies may have existed. "I would like to think they are real fairies. We've all got children in us, haven't we? At heart we're still children, even though I'm over 60, she said. "I would hope that the fairies were there at some stage. My mother knew Elsie Wright. Elsie was older than my mother, and she always thought she was a bit strange, perhaps a little yonderly, I think. She was on another plane to everyone else, so she may have had some sort of psychic powers that other people didn't." Margaret does not accept Elsie's explanation. "I think it would be very difficult to photograph fairies with hat pins without something showing." Colin Hardin adds, "I think the thing to bear in mind, of course, was that whether or not the photos are fakes doesn't affect the notion of whether fairies may or may not be real. But despite Elsie's confession, people still seem to be fascinated by the story of the Cottingley fairies. Just a few years ago, movie stars including Harvey Keitel and Peter O'Toole and the film crews descended on West Yorkshire to film a fairy tale, a true story. But perhaps we should listen to Conan Doyle's contemporary J.M. Barrie, who wrote in his famous novel Peter Pan, Every time you say you don't believe in fairies, a fairy dies. And I also found a very nice fairy poem by Robert Montgomery Bird. Come cuddle close in Daddy's coat, beside the fire so bright, and hear about the fairy folk that wander in the night. For when the stars are shining clear, and all the world is still, they float across the silver moon, from hill to cloudy hill. Their caps of red, their cloaks of green, are hung with silver bells, and when they've shaken with the wind, their merry ringing swells. And riding on the crimson moth, with black spots on their wings, they guide them down the purple sky, with golden bridle rings. They love to visit girls and boys, to see how sweet they sleep, to stand beside their cosy cots, and at their faces peep. For in the whole of fairyland they have no finer sight than little children sleeping sound, with faces rosy bright. On tiptoe crowding round their heads, when bright the moonlight beams, they whisper little tender words that fill their minds with dreams. And when they see a sunny smile, with lightest fingertips, they lay 100 kisses sweet upon the ruddy lips. And then the little spotted moths spread out their crimson wings, and bear away the fairy crowd with shaking bridal rings. Come bairnies, hide in Daddy's coat, beside the fire so bright, perhaps the little fairy folk will visit you tonight.